It is 2 p.m. on the 22nd of September, 1980, and the sky above western Iran has started to scream. Squadrons of Iraqi MiGs and Sukhoi streak low over the desert, engines shredding the afternoon quiet, and for the men standing on the tarmac below, the sound is almost beautiful before it becomes terrifying. 10 Iranian airbases are the targets. Mehrabad, Tabriz, Desful, Avaz. The pilots have been told this will be quick, surgical, decisive, a single blow that ends the argument before it begins. They believe it. Some of them are smiling. On the ground near the border, an Iraqi tank commander presses his palm against warm steel and feels the engine come alive beneath him. He has been told he will be in Khorramshahr within days, in Avaz within a week, and home in time for the harvest. He checks his watch. He checks it again. Men do this before they understand that time is about to stop behaving normally. Miles away, in a village so close to the border that its windows rattle when trucks pass on the Iranian side, a mother is hanging laundry when the first shockwave rolls through the air. She does not know what it is. She only knows that her youngest child has started crying, and that the sky has gone the color of a bruise. The men giving these orders believed the war would be over before the leaves changed. They were already too late. Radio operators on both sides of the border are shouting into handsets, relaying coordinates, confirming targets, requesting reinforcements that do not yet exist in the quantities anyone will need. Telephones ring in command posts and go unanswered because the men who might answer them are already running towards something else. Fighter jets disappear into smoke over Avaz. Officers pace command tents insisting, again and again, that this will be a short war, a correction, not a catastrophe. No one standing here realizes they have just stepped into one of the longest wars of the 20th century. 8 years of death have already begun, and almost no one in this moment has the faintest idea. By nightfall, Iraqi armored columns are pouring across the border along a 600-mile front, aimed at the Iranian province of Khuzestan, flat, oil-rich, and populated by a significant Arabic-speaking minority that Baghdad believes will rise up and welcome its liberators. In Baghdad, state radio is already using the word victory. In Tehran, the government is still trying to understand the scale of what has happened. Explosions continue through the night. Families lie awake listening to a sound they cannot yet name, not knowing it will become the background noise of their entire childhoods. Neither country knew it yet, but history had just locked them inside a war that refused to end. Somewhere in the smoke and the certainty of that first night, a mistake is already being made, and it is not the mistake anyone will spend the next 8 years talking about. The mistake is simpler than strategy, and far more dangerous. Both governments believe the other side will break quickly. Iraq believes Iran, exhausted by revolution and purges and international isolation, is too weak to fight a real war. Iran believes Iraq's army, however large on paper, cannot survive contact with a population defending its homeland. Both are wrong in the same direction. They have each convinced themselves that certainty is the same thing as truth. That confusion, more than any tank or aircraft, is the weapon that will do the most damage over the next 3,000 days. But that wasn't the real reason the war started. Not the whole reason. Something older is underneath it, and the documentary is not ready to show it yet. For now, watch the celebrations. In Baghdad, crowds gather beneath portraits of a president who has spent 18 months positioning himself as the unquestioned voice of the Arab world, a man who watched a revolution next door dismantle a monarchy and replace it with something he finds both contemptible and, quietly, terrifying. He gives a speech. He calls the operation a defense of Arab sovereignty over the Shatt al-Arab waterway, the muddy tidal river where the Tigris and Euphrates meet the sea, the river that ships must cross to reach Iraq's only real deep-water port. He does not mention, not yet, how personal this war already is for him. In Tehran, the mood is different but no less charged. A new government, barely 18 months old, still consolidating power after toppling a monarchy, still purging its own military of officers suspected of loyalty to the old order, now finds itself facing an invasion it did not plan for and, in the confusion of revolution, did not fully prepare against. And yet something happens that no analyst in Washington or Moscow predicted. Among the men crossing into Khuzestan in those first weeks is a 19-year-old Iraqi conscript who has told his younger sisters, with total confidence, that he will be home before the winter rains. He has packed lightly. He has left, deliberately, a debt unpaid to a neighbor, a small joke between them about settling it once he returns a hero. He does not know yet that the war will still be grinding through that same stretch of border in 4 years, in 6 years, in 8. Men like him are the ones this story keeps returning to, because the general certainty and the conscript certainty are not the same certainty at all. One is strategy, the other is simply the only way a person can carry a rifle toward an unknown country and still put one foot in front of the other. The invasion does not break Iran. It reassembles it. What happened next shocked even the generals who ordered the invasion in the first place. Within days, Iraqi forces have pushed deep into Khuzestan, encircling the city of Khorramshahr, a port so strategically vital that its capture is treated in Baghdad as the opening act of total victory. But sieges are strange things. They compress time. They turn weeks into decades for the people trapped inside them, and Khorramshahr, more than any other place in the first year of this war, will teach both nations exactly how expensive certainty can be. Inside the city, Iranian defenders, regular soldiers mixed with volunteers, some of them teenagers who have never fired a weapon before this month, fight from house to house, street to street, room to room. The Iraqi army has more armor, more artillery, more air support. The defenders have something else. They are not fighting for territory on a map. They are fighting inside their own homes, and men fight differently when the walls collapsing around them used to be their kitchen. It takes Iraq 34 days to take Khorramshahr. Baghdad calls it a victory. Inside Iran, a different word begins to spread. Khorramshahr, the city of blood. By the time they understood what this siege had cost them, both sides had learned something they would spend the rest of the war refusing to admit out loud. This would not be quick, and it would not be clean, and there is no way to occupy a country whose people have decided, with sudden and total unanimity, that they would rather die than be governed by the men now shelling their cities. This is where everything began to unravel. A young Iranian Revolutionary Guard volunteer, no older than 19, writes a letter home from a trench outside Avaz. He tells his mother the fighting is difficult but righteous. He does not tell her about the smell, or the sound artillery makes when it lands close enough to lift you off the ground without touching you, or the way his hands have started shaking at night in a way they never used to. He signs the letter the way he always has. He does not know it will be the last one she receives. Across the line, an Iraqi conscript, a farmer's son from near Basra who was handed a rifle 6 weeks earlier and told he would be home for the harvest, watches the horizon each morning for aircraft that might be his own or might not be. He has stopped believing anyone's estimate of how long this will take. He has started counting days instead of believing promises. Mothers on both sides of the border have begun waiting for letters that arrive less and less often, and when they stop arriving altogether, no official telegram follows for weeks, sometimes months, because the bureaucracies of both nations are drowning in casualties faster than they can process the paperwork of grief. But hidden beneath the battlefield was another war entirely, a war of ideas, of fear, of history so old that neither side's soldiers fully understood why they were being asked to die for it. To understand what is actually happening here, the story has to go backward, not to the invasion, not even to the revolution, but centuries earlier, to a border that has never once, in the modern era, been fully settled to both nations' satisfaction. The Shatt al-Arab is not simply a river. It is the only reliable maritime access Iraq has to the Persian Gulf, which makes control over it a matter of national survival for Baghdad and a matter of sovereignty for Tehran. Treaties have shifted this border for 100 years, in 1937, in 1975, each time in favor of whichever nation held more leverage at the negotiating table. In 1975, Iraq, weakened by a Kurdish insurgency that Iran was quietly arming, agreed to split the waterway down its deepest channel in exchange for Iran cutting off support to the Kurds. Saddam Hussein, then vice president, signed that agreement because he had no other choice. He has never forgiven himself for it, and he has certainly never forgiven Iran. 5 years later, everything changes. The Shah who forced that humiliating concession is gone, driven from power by a revolution that replaces a monarchy allied with the West with a theocracy that explicitly calls for revolutionary Islamic governments to rise across the region, including, unmistakably, in Iraq, where a Sunni-led government rules over a Shia majority population that suddenly has an inspiring example 70 miles away. Saddam Hussein does not see an opportunity to rewrite one river border. He sees a chance to reverse a decade of humiliation, to crush a revolution before it can export itself, to become, in a single stroke, the unrivaled leader of the Arab world. He believes Iran is too broken to fight back. They couldn't have been more wrong. By early 1981, both nations are locked into something that no longer resembles the war either government promised its people. Front lines that were supposed to shift by the week now barely move for months. Artillery duels flatten towns that no map bothered to name. Oil facilities, the economic lifeblood both nations need to fund the fighting, burn day and night along the Gulf Coast, filling the sky with a black haze that pilots on both sides use as a landmark. A journalist embedded briefly with Iranian forces near the front describes, in a dispatch that will be quoted for decades afterward, a landscape that looks less like a battlefield and more like the aftermath of some enormous, indifferent catastrophe: flooded fields, burned villages, unexploded ordnance scattered like litter, and everywhere, the particular silence that follows sustained bombardment. A silence so complete it feels like its own kind of violence. Then something happened that changed everything. In the spring of 1982, Iran launches Operation Undeniable Victory, and the entire war pivots on its axis. What Baghdad has spent a year and a half treating as a slow, grinding, ultimately winnable occupation collapses in the span of weeks. Iranian forces, reorganized around a mixture of regular army units and the increasingly powerful Revolutionary Guard, break the siege lines around Khorramshahr and begin pushing Iraqi forces back toward the border they crossed 19 months earlier. By May, Khorramshahr, Khorramshahr, the city of blood, is retaken. Iraqi forces retreat in disarray, abandoning equipment, abandoning positions, in some cases abandoning each other. For one brief, vertiginous moment, it looks as though the war might actually end here, on Iranian terms, with Iraq expelled from the territory it invaded and an outcome that resembles, more or less, the world as it existed before the 22nd of September 1980. Then something happens that no one outside Tehran's inner circle predicted, something that will extend this war by 6 more years and cost hundreds of thousands more lives. Iran decides not to stop at the border. They believed victory was only days away. The logic in Tehran is not irrational, even if it will prove catastrophic. Iraq's army is in retreat. Its government looks unstable. If Iranian forces push into Iraqi territory now, the reasoning goes, they might topple Saddam Hussein entirely, replace his government with a friendly Shia-led administration, and export the revolution that so many in Tehran believe is the region's destiny. It is an intoxicating idea. It is also a fatal miscalculation, because everything that made Iranian resistance so devastatingly effective, defending home soil, fighting with the ferocity of people protecting their own families, evaporates the moment Iranian soldiers cross into Iraq. Now they are the invaders. Now Iraq soldiers, whatever their private doubts about the war, are the ones defending home ground. And now the international community, which had been quietly uncomfortable with an Iraqi invasion of Iran, becomes considerably less uncomfortable when the roles reverse. This is the point at which outside powers stop pretending to be neutral. The United States, still raw from the hostage crisis in Tehran less than 2 years earlier, begins quietly supporting Iraq, sharing intelligence, normalizing diplomatic relations, looking away from weapons programs it will spend the next decade publicly condemning in every other context. The Soviet Union, Iraq's traditional arms supplier, keeps the weapons flowing despite occasional tensions. France sells Iraq advanced fighter aircraft and missiles. Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, funnel billions of dollars in loans to Baghdad, terrified of what an Iranian victory might mean for their own Shia populations and their own monarchies. Iran, isolated, sanctioned, and distrusted by nearly every government on earth, is left buying weapons on the black market, through intermediaries, at markups that drain its economy, including, in a detail that will not become fully public for years, limited and covert arms deals with the very United States government that is simultaneously arming its enemy. Nobody wants this war to end quickly anymore. Too many governments have found a use for it. How much worse can this become? Why won't either side stop? Who benefits from this? The war the world watches from a distance is a war of maps and communiques. The war the people inside it experience is something else entirely. A doctor working in a field hospital near the front in Iran describes shifts that stretch to 30 hours, corridors lined with wounded men waiting for surgeons who are already operating on someone else, and a particular sound, not screaming, something quieter, more resigned, that she says never leaves her, even decades later, even in the silence of ordinary rooms. An Iraqi oil worker, whose refinery has been targeted twice in bombing raids meant to cripple both nations' ability to fund their armies, describes watching men he has known his entire life die not in some dramatic act of combat but in the mundane, arbitrary violence of infrastructure warfare, a strike meant to hit an economy that happened to be standing where he was standing. A child in Basra, 7 years old when the war begins, will spend her entire remaining childhood inside it. Air raid sirens as ordinary as school bells, the particular geography of which rooms in her house are considered safe, a vocabulary of destruction so normalized that she does not fully understand, until she is an adult, that other children elsewhere grew up without it. Let viewers sit with that for a moment. An entire generation on both sides of this border will grow up not remembering peace. Not as an abstraction. As a simple, literal fact, they have never experienced it. A fighter pilot who flew missions for Iraq in the war's early years describes a version of combat almost no ground soldier would recognize: long stretches of silence at altitude, the ordinary hum of an engine, and then seconds of total chaos, followed immediately by silence again, as though the war could only tolerate violence in short, controlled bursts before retreating back into its usual, grinding patience. He says the hardest missions were never the ones with the heaviest resistance. They were the ones flown over towns he recognized, where he found himself, for a fraction of a second before releasing a payload, thinking about whether anyone he had once known still lived beneath him. A military planner on the Iranian side, interviewed long after the war's end, describes the particular psychological toll of drafting operations he privately doubted, because doubting out loud, in a government still consolidating its revolutionary authority, carried its own kind of danger. He says the planners on both sides were, in a sense, fighting two wars simultaneously, one against the enemy across the border, and one against the political consequences, back home, of ever admitting the war might not be winnable. A journalist who covered the conflict from both capitals over several years says the hardest thing to convey to audiences abroad was not the scale of the destruction, which was, in its way, easy enough to photograph. It was the ordinariness that destruction had settled into, that by the third or fourth year, families had stopped treating air raid warnings as emergencies and started treating them as weather, something to be waited out rather than feared in the original, acute sense. She says that adaptation, more than any single battle, was the detail that convinced her this war would last far longer than anyone in either capital was willing to say aloud. By 1983, Iran begins deploying a tactic that will define the war's most horrifying imagery and its most controversial legacy: the human wave assault. Waves of soldiers, regular infantry, Revolutionary Guard volunteers, and, in a detail that remains one of the war's most disputed and painful legacies, boys as young as 13 or 14, some given plastic keys said to guarantee entry to paradise if they die in battle, advance across minefields and fortified positions, absorbing catastrophic casualties in order to clear paths for follow-up forces or simply to exhaust Iraqi ammunition and morale through sheer, relentless attrition. Iraqi machine gunners describe, in accounts given long after the war, a particular horror in this kind of combat, not the fear of losing, but the psychological toll of what winning requires, of the sound before the guns even open fire, of realizing that the enemy's willingness to sacrifice its own children in these numbers is not going to be broken by any amount of firepower Baghdad can bring to bear. This is not war as either side's planners imagined it in September of 1980. This is something closer to an act of mutual, deliberate exhaustion, both governments betting that the other will collapse first, both willing to feed staggering numbers of their own citizens into that bet. The war has stopped behaving like a conflict between two armies. It has started behaving like something else, something patient, something that feeds on the very attempts made to end it. Through 1982 and into 1983, Iran launches a string of offensives that will become, in military histories written decades later, shorthand for an entire strategy, but to the people living inside them, each one is simply another name for the same unbroken nightmare. Operation Ramadan, in the summer of 1982, sends Iranian forces toward Basra itself, Iraq's second city, in an assault meant to finally break the war open. It fails, at a staggering cost, against Iraqi defenses reinforced with foreign-supplied artillery and, for the first time at this scale, tactical use of chemical agents that Iranian medics are not yet equipped to treat. Operation Dawn follows in the marshlands near the border, where Iranian units navigate flooded reed beds under fire, an environment so specific and so brutal that veterans describe it less as combat and more as a slow negotiation with drowning. Operation Karbala, launched in early 1987, pushes even closer to Basra, and for a moment military planners in Baghdad will later admit came far closer to catastrophe than public statements at the time suggested. It looks as though the city might actually fall. It does not fall. Each of these operations follows an identical, exhausting rhythm. Initial breakthroughs. Momentum. A brief, intoxicating sense that this, finally, might be the offensive that ends it. And then the counterattack, the reinforcement, the stalemate, the retreat back to roughly the positions held months earlier, except now with tens of thousands more names added to lists that no government has fully finished counting. A foreign diplomat stationed in the region during these years later describes the strange sensation of watching the war from just outside it, reading the same optimistic communiques issued by both capitals after every operation, and slowly realizing that optimism itself had become a kind of currency, printed and circulated regardless of what was actually happening on the ground. He recalls briefings where officials from both governments, separately, described the war as nearly won. Neither was lying, exactly. Both had simply stopped being able to tell the difference between hope and information. This is where the war stops behaving like two nations trying to defeat each other, and starts behaving like two nations trying to outlast each other, a distinction that sounds small and is not small at all, because a war fought to outlast an opponent has no natural stopping point. There is no line on a map that ends it. There is only exhaustion, and neither side has yet run out. Every apparent victory in this war was, in some sense, also a trap. In 1983 and increasingly through 1984, reports begin reaching international observers of a new horror on the battlefield. Iraq, facing manpower disadvantages against Iran's larger population and increasingly desperate human wave tactics, begins using chemical weapons, mustard gas first, later nerve agents, against Iranian forces and, in the war's final and most notorious atrocities, against Iraqi Kurdish civilians accused of sympathizing with Iran. Survivors describe a smell like garlic or rotting onions drifting across the trench lines, and then a slow-motion horror, skin blistering, lungs filling, men who survived the initial exposure living the rest of their lives with respiratory damage, blindness, and cancers that would not fully manifest for decades. International bodies document these attacks. Global condemnation is, by any honest measure, muted. Iraq's usefulness as a counterweight to Iran outweighs, in the calculations of several major powers, the horror of what is being documented. This is one of the war's darkest and most persistent questions, one this documentary will not resolve neatly, because it cannot be resolved neatly. How does an act universally described as a war crime generate so little consequence for the government that committed it while it is actively occurring? Meanwhile, beginning in 1984, a new front opens that has nothing to do with trenches or infantry at all. It happens on water. The tanker war. Both nations, unable to break each other on land, begin attacking commercial oil tankers in the Persian Gulf, Iraq targeting ships trading with Iran, Iran retaliating against ships trading with Iraq's Gulf allies, particularly Kuwait. Over the course of several years, hundreds of vessels are attacked, damaged, or sunk. Insurance rates for Gulf shipping spike to unprecedented levels. Foreign navies, including the United States, begin escorting tankers through the Gulf, occasionally exchanging direct fire with Iranian forces, a war within the war, one that threatens, at several points, to pull outside powers into direct combat. It is during this phase, in July of 1988, that the war produces one of its most devastating and disputed tragedies. A United States Navy warship, operating in the Persian Gulf amid escalating tension with Iranian naval forces, misidentifies a civilian Iran air passenger flight as an attacking military aircraft and shoots it down, killing all 290 people aboard, most of them Iranian civilians on their way to Mecca. The incident becomes, for many Iranians, a symbol of the war's fundamental cruelty, that after nearly 8 years of fighting, ordinary families going about ordinary lives can still be erased in an instant, by a mistake, from 30,000 feet, and that the world's most powerful navy will call it an accident and move on. Back on land, both nations turn increasingly to a tactic that removes any remaining distinction between soldier and civilian, the war of the cities. Iraq launches modified Scud missiles at Tehran and other Iranian population centers. Iran retaliates against Baghdad and Basra. For weeks at a time, Ordinary families in both capitals live with air raid sirens as a nightly ritual, uncertain whether the next missile will strike a military installation or their own street. A mother in Tehran describes teaching her children, calmly, mechanically, which corner of which room is safest, the way another parent might teach a child to look both ways before crossing a street, an entire ordinary vocabulary of survival built around the expectation that missiles are simply part of what a childhood now contains. Every apparent turning point in this war, Khorramshahr retaken, the tanker war, each side's missile campaigns, was supposed to be the moment that finally forced the other side to negotiate. Each time, it only proved that both governments were willing to go further than the last atrocity suggested was possible. In border towns hit hardest by artillery and missile exchanges, schools have been rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt again so many times that some communities simply stop replacing the windows. Children in these towns learn a specific, practical geography, which corridor holds, which wall does not, which teacher will keep calm long enough to matter if the sirens start during a lesson. In the rubble of one such school, after a strike that Iraqi forces will later describe as targeting military infrastructure that turns out, on inspection, to have been nothing of the sort, searchers find school bags still packed for the next day's classes. There will be no next day's classes for weeks. By the mid-1980s, the economic toll of the war has become its own kind of front line. Both nations, dependent on oil revenue to fund the fighting, watch their production and export capacity shrink under the weight of attacks on refineries, tankers, and terminals. Iran rations basic goods. Iraq borrows staggering sums from Gulf allies who will, within a few years, want that money back under circumstances neither lender nor borrower has yet imagined. Inflation erodes savings on both sides of the border. Families who once measured the war in casualties now measure it in things they can no longer afford, a slower and quieter kind of loss that rarely makes it into any official history, but that survivors, decades later, remember with startling precision. By 1987 and into 1988, something has shifted, though it takes time to become visible even to the people living through it. Iraq, having spent years absorbing the shock of Iran's early counteroffensives, has rebuilt its military with a scale and sophistication that Iran, isolated and increasingly exhausted, cannot match. A series of Iraqi offensives in the spring and summer of 1988, supported by extensive and, in several documented cases, chemical weapons use, retake Iraqi territory that Iranian forces had held for years. Iran's economy, strained by nearly 8 years of war, sanctions, and declining oil revenue, is approaching collapse. Its population, having absorbed staggering casualties, is exhausted in a way that outlasts even revolutionary fervor. In July 1988, Iran's leadership, including the revolution's own founding figure, who had for years described any settlement short of total victory as unthinkable, accepts a United Nations ceasefire resolution. Accounts from within the Iranian government describe the decision, in a phrase that would become one of the war's most quoted and most haunting lines, as more painful than drinking poison. The ceasefire takes effect on the 20th of August, 1988. There is no victory parade for either side. There is no treaty signed with triumphant photographs. There is, in both capitals, something closer to a collective exhale, the sound not of relief, but of an exhaustion so total that even celebration feels like it would require energy neither nation has left. By the time they understood there was no victory left to claim, nearly 1 million people, soldiers and civilians combined, though no one has ever agreed on an exact number, were dead. Millions more had been displaced. Cities that had existed for centuries had been reduced, in places, to rubble that would take a generation to clear. The border that started all of this, the Shatt al-Arab waterway, the muddy tidal river neither government could agree how to share, is, when the guns finally fall silent, essentially unchanged from where it stood on the morning of the 22nd of September 1980. An entire war, 8 years long, one of the longest conventional conflicts of the 20th century, ends with the geography that supposedly caused it looking almost exactly the way it did before the first shot was fired. Veterans on both sides spend the rest of their lives carrying a version of this war that outsiders rarely see. An Iraqi soldier, blinded in a chemical attack in the war's final year, describes learning to navigate a world he can no longer see in a country that, within a few years, will be at war again, this time invading Kuwait, and then, within a decade, facing invasion itself. An Iranian veteran, both legs lost to a landmine outside of Az, describes decades spent watching his own government alternately honor and quietly forget men like him, depending on which anniversary is being commemorated that particular year. Families on both sides are, to this day, still searching for the remains of sons and brothers listed only as missing, men whose bodies were never recovered from minefields, from collapsed trenches, from the enormous, indifferent geography of a war that swallowed them without ceremony. Children who were born the year the war started are, by the time it ends, old enough to have fought in it themselves. There is a question this documentary has been circling since its opening frame, and it does not have a clean answer. Why did two nations, each convinced within weeks that the war should never have started, spend 8 years and nearly 1 million lives failing to stop something both governments privately understood, for most of that time, to be unwinnable? Part of the answer is pride, the political cost, for either government, of admitting the war had been a mistake. Part of it is the outside powers who found the conflict useful precisely because it was unresolved, who supplied weapons and intelligence and loans specifically to ensure that neither side won decisively enough to end it. Part of it is simpler and darker than politics. Once enough people have died for a cause, stopping starts to feel like a second betrayal of everyone already lost, even when continuing only produces more of the same grief. None of this fully explains it. Perhaps nothing could. What can be said, with more confidence, is this: wars rarely end when the reasons for fighting them do. They end when the people funding them, fighting them, and burying the dead from them simply cannot continue any longer. And by then, the original argument, the muddy river, the wounded pride of a vice president forced into a humiliating treaty a decade earlier, has long since stopped mattering to anyone actually holding a rifle. The war outlives its own justification. It becomes, for a while, the only reality either nation knows how to inhabit. That is, perhaps, the most unsettling truth this story has to offer, not that two governments made catastrophic decisions in September of 1980, but that once those decisions were made, an entire machinery of pride, foreign interest, and accumulated grief made it almost impossible for anyone, on either side, to be the one who said, out loud and early enough to matter, that this had already gone too far. Saddam Hussein would go on to invade Kuwait 2 years later, an act that would eventually end in his own government's collapse and, ultimately, his execution. The revolution he tried to crush before it could spread would outlast him. The river neither side could agree on remains, to this day, disputed in its particulars, quiet on its surface, and utterly indifferent to the number of people who died arguing over it. The guns eventually fell silent. But silence does not always mean peace. Sometimes, it simply means the survivors have run out of tears.